Welcome to the History and Heritage Podcast with me, Liam Blake. Join me as we uncover hidden stories and insights that shaped our world. From mysteries to legacies, join us on this journey through time. Listeners, you will know this is the first episode of this podcast, so what better way to start with one of the most famous instances of Irish history, the Great Famine. Now, when people think of the famine, they think of two things. One is obviously the millions of people who died, and the other is emigration, mostly to England and America. So what better way than to interview somebody with Irish parents, Irish heritage, born in England, and now living in America? Professor Christine Kinealy, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Welcome. Thank you for inviting me, Liam.
So I suppose a good place to start would be give us like background, maybe slightly before the famine, just set the scene, I suppose.
Yeah, it's hard to just provide context because really, I think when we talk about the famine, we have to understand it in the context of Ireland as a colony and that relationship with England, which then becomes Britain, had gone back for hundreds of years and had changed. But by the time we get to 1845, Ireland had been part of the United Kingdom since 1800. And as a consequence of that, Ireland no longer had its own parliament, but was governed throughout the famine period until 1921 from the Westminster Parliament in London, which meant that all decisions were made from London, not inside Ireland. The population of Ireland in 1845 was large, 8.5 million people and growing. And Irish people were dependent on potatoes to a large extent. About 40% of people in Ireland had a subsistence diet of potatoes. And we might think of that as bad, but they ate them with buttermilk. And we now know that buttermilk and potatoes, if you eat the skin, is a highly nutritious diet. So on the eve of the famine, Irish people had a very healthy diet, and we think they were one of the tallest people in Europe because of their diet. So it's sort of a mixed bag of things. But again, what we know is that because I'm sorry, my dog is cuddling into me. If you hear rattling of paper, just so you know, I have a dog, Coo. So Ireland leaves the famine, governed from London, fast-growing population, a population that's highly dependent on one crop that generally is reliable. The potato had failed occasionally, but whenever it failed, the next year it came back. And so when it fails in 1845, people think the following year will be fine. Of course, we know it wasn't.
Just a question on that always kind of not confuse me, but in less developed countries now, and obviously Ireland back then, there was a lot more countries back then of the phrase staple food, where essentially that was all that the Irish ate, let's say. Nearly as the famine, I suppose, exposed, if that was gone, everything was gone. Tell us like a little bit about the idea of staple foods, I suppose.
Yeah, so we often say staple or subsistence food, which means it's the one crop that many people depend on. And this is very common in countries that have been colonized. So the same in Ireland, it's not that people in the country only grew potatoes, but the poor people only had access to them. So we know Ireland before the famine was growing a lot of really high quality produce, corn, which when we say corn, we mean wheat, barley, oats. Massive amounts of corn was being grown every year. But because of, again, the colonial context, corn was being used to pay for rent, and most corn was being exported to Britain. And if you think of Britain, 1845, this is a country that's industrializing very, very rapidly. So people are living in towns and cities, they're working in factories, they're not growing their own food. They need it to come into them. And some people described Ireland in 1845 as the breadbasket of the United Kingdom because enough corn was leaving Ireland every year to feed 1 million people in Britain. So although a high proportion of the Irish population were dependent on potatoes, that didn't reflect what was being grown in the country. If we think of other exports, it's been estimated 90 million eggs every year before 1845 were being exported from Ireland to Britain. Oysters, salmon, fish of every description were being exported to Britain. And the other thing we sometimes forget is alcohol. And all these things continued to be exported after 1845. So at this stage, Ireland was a mass producer of whiskey, high quality whiskey, and of what was called porter. We now call it Guinness. But they were taking up grain, and all of those exports continued throughout the famine period. So this is a country that is actually quite agriculturally diverse. But if you're poor in Ireland, the only choice you have is to subsist on potatoes.
So we will come back to the continuation of exportation of foods during the famine. We will come back to that in a little bit. But tell me, so we have kind of, I suppose, the context of the impending disaster now. But tell me, like, when is the famine known as? I know there's probably not like a direct, 21st of May or whatever, but the start date and what kind of kicked it off. Obviously, there was just the failure of the crops, but was there anything else to kick it off as well? Or
Yeah. So trying to find a starting point and a finish point for the famine really depends on how you define famine. So some people think famine is simply shortage of food. Famine is a much more complicated process. And again, it has to be seen in what happens before and what happens afterwards. So some historians would date the start of the famine from August, September 1845, because that's when the blight first appeared in Ireland. And this was a new form of disease. No one knew what caused it. No one knew what the antidote to it was. So there were rare sightings August and then more by September, etc. And 1845 to 46, approximately 40% of the crop was destroyed. Now, Irish people, as I said, had faced years of shortages before, and they were resilient. They knew what to do. They could, eke out what goods they had. If they had a pig, they could sell it or slaughter it. They could pawn their fishing tackle, etc., etc. All in the expectation the next year would be a good year. The British government did get involved and brought some food into the country, provided some employment, gave some money to local areas. So 1845 to the harvest of 1846, we really go harvest to harvest, so August to August. Nobody really died. People did suffer, and there was certainly shortages, but it seems nobody died. So for some historians, they don't like to use the word famine 1845 because if we think about famine in terms of mortality, people didn't die. They suffered, but they didn't die. Unfortunately, 1846, this disease came back, and it came back earlier in the harvest, and it destroyed pretty well the whole of the crop. That year, there was also a bad corn harvest. And that year, unfortunately, the winter was really brutal. It snowed for 4 months, which is pretty unusual. I know you've had snow, but so it was just a combination of factors. And the British government, there'd been a change of government, and the British government decided they'd have a new policy of if people wanted assistance, they had to work on public works. And in Ireland, we know public works, walls that surround nothing, roads that need nowhere. And that's exactly what they were. But if you think of this in the context of people who often had pawned their warm cloaks, their shoes if they had them, and had very, very little food in the midst of a freezing cold winter, this policy was disastrous. And so by the end of 1846, people are dying literally in their thousands. And so some historians and people like to date the famine from the end of 1846 when we start to see mass mortality.
can we go back a little bit into 1846? I think it was around June. So I'm linking this to modern day because you're over in America and you have just had an election. Well,
Oh,
not
yes.
that long ago, a presidential election, and we in Ireland are due to have parliamentary election this week. Yeah, the end
Yep.
of this week.
Yeah.
So there was an election, according to my notes anyway that I gathered, there was an election at the middle of 1846. And would that have affected policies? Do you think that had a big effect on how the famine played out?
Yes, but if I can just clarify, there wasn't an election. The leader of what was called the Conservative Party, Sir Robert Peel, he had to resign. He'd lost the support of his party, so he stepped down in June 1846. And that split his party. So throughout the whole of the famine, the Conservatives were in a really weak position in opposition because they were split into two. When Sir Robert Peel resigned, he was replaced by what was called the Whig government, WHIG, and that was led by Lord John Russell. So there wasn't an election in 1846, but there was a change of government. But there had to be an election because of parliamentary rules in 1847. So there was an election in 1847. So when Lord John Russell came into power, he came in at the head of a minority government, quite a weak leader. And he knew that within a year he was facing the electorate. And I think it had a massive impact because he tried to please people. He wanted to be voted in. And so he came in promising cheap government and saying, maybe we've been too generous to Ireland. We have to revisit this position. So from the very outset, he was determined not to be too generous to Ireland, even though when the potato crop failed again, Irish people were much more vulnerable.
In my notes, and that note was slightly off, so hopefully this one won't be. This was, I think, 1847. I suppose a political act called the Gregory Clause prohibited anyone who held more than a quarter of an acre of land from receiving public assistance. That, like, again, I'm going to say the words, the effect of that, just explain, please, a lot. So, yeah, explain the effect of that, I suppose.
Yeah, it was a really cruel piece of legislation. So as we go through the period of the famine, the British government responds in different ways. And as we know, the public works were disastrous, making people do hard physical labour, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, and having to walk to the place where they worked in terrible weather conditions. People just died in their thousands. And from the British government's perspective, these relief works were ineffective and they were also expensive because they had put in place such a complicated bureaucracy in order to check that nobody was cheating them. So anyway, summer 1847, the British government introduced soup kitchens for a brief period. And for the first and only time, this meant that people were receiving free rations of food every day. But the British government saw this only as a temporary solution, even though it was pretty effective, because they wanted Irish people to pay for Irish poverty. And so in August 1847, there was another change of policy. And this time, the policy was the Irish Poor Law, based on the workhouse system, is responsible for all relief in future. And what this essentially meant was that the British government was shifting all financial responsibility from Britain or the United Kingdom to Ireland. Effectively, it was saying, even though we have a so called United Kingdom, in reality, it doesn't matter because now, in time of distress, Irish taxpayers have to pay for what is going on in Ireland. So, this legislation was introduced. It was very cruel legislation, but perhaps one of the cruelest aspects of it was what you alluded to, the Gregory Clause. And this was actually introduced by an Irishman, an Irish landlord from County Galway, William Gregory. He was a member of the British Parliament. At, as you say, it stated that nobody who occupied more than a quarter of an acre of land could get any form of relief. And a quarter of an acre of land for a family was tiny. You couldn't survive on it. But what this legislation did was it meant that people who had survived for 2 years, by whatever means, now had to face that really awful choice of giving up their little piece of land if they wanted relief or trying to eke out an existence. And so we talk about evictions during the famine, but in fact, we have to add to the evictions the large number of people who voluntarily surrendered their land in order to survive.
Now, this is a very brief thing I wanted you to talk about because I think it was very brief, if I remember correctly. The Young Irelander Rebellion in 1848. Am I correct in saying that that was very brief?
Yeah. So 1848 in Europe was known as the Year of Revolutions. So there were bad crops everywhere. There was no famine like in Ireland, but there was turmoil everywhere. People were disillusioned with the government. So there were revolutions. Some countries like Italy and Germany wanted to be united, wanted to be independent, etc. In France, there was dissatisfaction with the government. So 1848, there were revolutions everywhere. Ireland, in some ways, was on the tail end of that. Ireland, as you know, was a very politicised country and had been politicised by Daniel O'Connell, who had been, unfortunately died 1847, but he had mobilised people and organised them with his mass meetings, etc. And through that, he'd achieved Catholic emancipation. He wanted to achieve a repeal of the Act of Union, but he was never successful. But he formed a repeal association, and within that repeal association, there were a group of people, men and women, who were really brilliant intellectuals, who believed in the regeneration of Ireland, who believed in cultural nationalism, and they started their own newspaper, The Nation. But the famine radicalised them. People we think of when we think of Young Ireland, John Mitchell, who was the leader, the firebrand, very brilliant. Speranza, Jane Elgee, Oscar Wilde's mother. Thomas Davis, unfortunately, he died 1845. William Smith O'Brien, aristocratic from County Clare, member of British Parliament. But anyway, Young Ireland broke away from O'Connell, and they were very radicalised by what they saw in 1847. And so in 1848, they decided they should have a rebellion. At this stage, the British government was arresting them, accusing them of treason, of sedition, etc. And so they decided if they didn't rebel, they never could. And they chose, as you're a Tipperary man, a place in Tipperary, Bishop McCormick's cabbage patch, as it was dismissively called, Ballingarry, to lead the rebellion at the end of July 1848. And they knew it wouldn't succeed. It was almost a gesture of resistance against the British government. And as you say, it was short-lived. These men were not military men, and they were very idealistic. Some of them gave themselves up. Thomas Francis Marr, who was only 24 years old, William Smith O'Brien, essentially gave themselves up. And a small number of the men were sentenced to be hung, drawn and quartered, which was the punishment for treason. And they languished in jail for a year. And then in 1849, just before Queen Victoria visited Ireland, they were sent to Tasmania. And their stories are incredible. Most of them escaped, ended up in America, fought on different sides in the American Civil War, etc. I'm sure you know about that. But just to come back to your question, there was a very short-lived rebellion. It had no chance of success against the British Army. Tipperary was chosen as a remote place, and it probably lasted 3 hours. But the good thing about that was there was very little bloodshed.
I'm going to come back to the soup kitchens that you mentioned a little while ago in a minute, but I need to mention, because you've mentioned deportations and you have mentioned food imports and things like that, and people, I suppose, the wealthy having food. Any listeners of this isn't Irish but are into sport and have played Ireland, they will have heard the Irish fans sing the Fields of Athenry. And the Fields of Athenry, if I'm not mistaken, is a famine time song. Mentions a big name from the famine, and I want you to talk a little bit about him. And I suppose maybe the Fields of Athenry, if you can, as in like the situation of that song, I guess, because there's a line in it, they stole Trevelyan's corn. So Trevelyan and his corn, just speak on, I guess.
Yeah. So the song was written by Pete St. John, who sadly we lost a few years ago, and it was written in the 1960s. So it was written retrospectively. And I had the pleasure of meeting Peter a few years ago. And I asked him, what was your inspiration? And he told me he read a book that came out in 1962 by a woman called Cecil Woodham Smith. It was called The Great Hunger. And I have to say she was one of the inspirations for my own research. She was Welsh, but of Irish background, a woman, not an academic, but she did more research than any of the academics of the time and put together a very powerful narrative of what happened during those years. And Pete St. John, like many people, her book was a bestseller. I think the most popular Irish history book ever to this day. I recommend reading it to everybody. But anyway, Pete St. John, like many people, read it and was very moved by her account and recognised that Charles Trevelyan, who was a civil servant and was there throughout, from 1845, throughout the change of government, he sort of recognised him as a villain. And I have to say it's hard to paint him in any other light than as a very unsympathetic, uncaring administrator. But anyway, so that song does date from the 1960s, and it's very powerful. I know you like sport. I actually happen to be a soccer supporter, and that song is sung every week from the stands by the fans that I am part of. So I'm very familiar with that song and how it's being used. And again, it's a very powerful song about a small place in the west of Ireland where a man, Michael, stole so his young could see the dawn and the morn. And he was deported to Australia. Now, it's a fictional account, but again, I think it sums up the desperation of some people. And we do know that people stole in order to actually go to jail or just to survive. So very difficult choice. But so Trevelyan really did exist, but the song is retrospective.
And now, so at the very start, I mentioned the countries of Ireland, the UK, which is obviously focusing on England, and the US. And I'm going to go to the US now because there was a figure. Well, there was probably many figures, but one that I picked out was Bishop John Hughes, and he was a Catholic bishop who did what I want you to talk, I suppose, maybe more broadly about. America was always, in times of trouble for Ireland, great at sending us help.
So John Hughes was actually a Tyrone man who'd emigrated to America as a young man and had a great vocation. And he was known to be quite a firebrand, to be fierce. He's sometimes called Dagger John because there was a lot of anti-Catholic feeling and there was some attempts to burn convents. And he stood up to people. And he was then moved to New York, and he very famously built St. Patrick's Cathedral. So that's one of his great legacies. But in 1847, he made a public lecture on behalf of the poor of Ireland, and he placed what was happening in Ireland in the context of centuries of British misrule. And he appealed to people to send money to Ireland, and people did. They responded to him. But just to your wider point, one of the incredible and most inspiring things about the Great Famine is that it actually triggered a spontaneous fundraising movement throughout the world on a scale that had never been seen before. So America did contribute and contributed very, very generously in multiple ways, but people throughout the world, in every part of the world, China, Australia, New Zealand, South America, etc., Russia, whatever, and of course the Sultan of Turkey, they sent money to Ireland. And most of those people had no connection with Ireland. And if we think of the donations from the Choctaws and the Cherokees, these were people who themselves were impoverished and marginalised, yet they felt compassion with the poor of Ireland.
I'm going to somewhat land the plane now, as in like finish up. But before I jump forward into the famine's effect, to talk about two people, because we talked briefly about evictions, and there are two names that in my research I had actually heard about before: Major Dennis Mahon and Mrs. Gerard. So can you talk to me about, I suppose, evictions in the famine more generally, and then those two people, if you
Yeah.
can?
So I know a lot about Dennis Mahon, less so about Mrs. Gerard, but she certainly is a name. And there are other names. Van der Leer in County Clare, he was known to be vicious in terms of his evictions. And this really goes back to what we talked about earlier, the 1847 legislation, whereby Irish people now were made responsible for what was happening in Ireland. And this really put a lot of financial pressure on landlords in Ireland. And some of these landlords, they hadn't had rent for 2 years, and some of them were struggling themselves. But for many landlords, especially the absentee landlords, they actually saw what was happening in Ireland as an opportunity to evict their poorest tenants, to get rid of them, to clear the land, to bring in cattle, sheep, etc., that would be more productive. So one of the cruelest things about the famine, especially after 1847, is the very high level of evictions, which created a whole new problem of homelessness. So after 1847, homelessness became as prevalent as hunger for the poor of Ireland. And the British government really didn't regulate it, just like with emigration. They preferred a laissez-faire attitude to sit back and let it happen. So again, very, very cruel. Colonel or Major Mahon, Dennis Mahon, was a bit different. He owned the estate in Strokestown. He'd inherited it. And when he took it over, it was in debt. And he actually had helped to set up soup kitchens. So he's sort of a mixed bag. But by 1847, he felt there was no end in sight. And he and his agent decided they would try and clear the land by offering a free passage to Canada. And 1847, Canada was cheaper to get to than America. So that sort of made sense. And so people voluntarily surrendered, but once they surrendered their land, they couldn't come back. So what we know, and I've been very involved with the people at Strokestown Park, is 1847, 1,490 of his tenants, mostly children, were sent to Canada. And they went from Strokestown in County Roscommon. They walked to Dublin, and that's a 100-mile walk. And I'm one of the 5 historians who were part of the inaugural National Famine Way Walk in 2019. So I can tell you it's tough, even with today's luxuries. But anyway, they walked along the canal, which was like a super highway of the time. They arrived in Dublin. In Dublin, they sailed on the ship over to Liverpool, sort of 12-hour crossing, not very pleasant. And then they spent either a few days or a few weeks in Liverpool waiting for boats to board to take them to Canada. They went on 4 different ships, and we know between 600 and 700 of these people did not make it. They either died aboard the ships taking them to Canada, the coffin ships, or when they arrived in Gross Eel, they died shortly afterwards. Word came back to Strokestown, and in November 1847, Major Dennis Mahon was assassinated. And this caused a shock and outrage throughout the world. Queen Victoria talked about how lawless these people of Ireland were. The Pope told his priests not to get involved in politics, etc. And people said, why are we giving money to Ireland when all they do is shoot landlords? So it sort of fed into a stereotypical narrative that the Irish don't deserve this. So the legacy of this is, you probably know that there is now a famine museum in Strokestown, and it's right next to the big house. So they tell the story of the 2 sides of Ireland at the time of the famine very, very well. Mahon didn't really evict, but he did encourage his tenants to surrender, and with disastrous effects. So, but evictions, as you said, they're just an integral part of the famine. And again, they just added to the whole suffering of the people, particularly after 1847.
I did mention that I was going to kind of try to land the plane, but before I do, I need to hop back a little bit because there is a very famous phrase, particularly around rural parts of Ireland. Oh, jokingly, particularly if somebody moves from their native parish to somewhere else. Oh, I took the soup.
Yeah.
And that phrase has roots in famine soup kitchens. But the phrase take the soup kind of made it as a phrase because the religion.
Yeah.
So explain that.
So feeding people with soup is sort of a quick, easy, efficient, and cheap way of feeding people, not always the most nutritious. So the Quakers, who did not convert anybody, they set up soup kitchens throughout Ireland. And then, as I said briefly, in the middle of 1847, the British government set up soup kitchens. But there were a third type of soup kitchens, and these were set up by what we would call proselytizers, people who wanted to use the hunger of the Irish people as a way to convert them to Protestantism. And there'd been various attempts before to convert the Irish Catholic population to Protestantism with not too much effect. And when we think of it, we think of Achill Island, where a very famous mission was established, and people would go, but they'd have to convert, listen to the Bible, etc. But again, not all, but some evangelical Protestants felt that the famine had been sent by God And one of those people was actually Charles Trevelyan. He was deeply religious, he was evangelical Protestant, and he believed that God had sent the famine to punish Irish people for being Catholic and for being lazy. And so that sort of fed into his argument we shouldn't give too much relief because it will happen again and again. But Protestant evangelicals saw the famine, saw the hunger of the people as an opportunity to try again to convert them. So they, with their funds, they came to Ireland, they set up schools, and essentially they came, as it said, with the Bible in one hand and the soup in the other. And it must have been a very hard dilemma for people who were starving or saw their children starving to say no to this soup. So some people did convert, and unfortunately, it left a long, bitter legacy. So people in my day would talk about, that family took the soup, and it was pretty, a damning thing to be, remembered as someone whose family took the soup. But I think we have to see it in the context of people who were desperate, who were starving. What would we do? I think I probably would take the soup. So, I would say we shouldn't judge them, but I think that phrase "taking the soup" has become very embedded in our memory of the famine.
You mentioned the words in my day, so I'm going to jump forward, I don't know how many years, 200 and something, to the modern day, I suppose. And there are so many places in everywhere from Australia to some places in England, mostly kind of Australia and America, that have Irish names. There's even an island in the Pacific that is called New Ireland, and there are so many communities of Irish that obviously that has to do with the immigration in the 50s due to economics, but also has to do with the famine. So can you tell me about like the legacy of the immigration, particularly within the famine? Obviously, as I say it, you are Liverpool by birth, which is one of the big places in England, as far as I understand, that has a massive Irish population, and obviously Liverpool by birth, Irish parents. So, can you tell me a little bit about the legacy of the immigration? I guess.
Yeah, and just when we think about the famine, we think 2 million people emigrated in less than 10 years, which is just an incredible number of people. And it wasn't the poorest. The poorest people died. They didn't have the means, the energy to emigrate. And what's interesting about famine emigration is that over 80% of those people chose to go to North America, either America or Canada. They didn't want to go to Britain. I know from my own family, it was the really poorest who generally ended up in Liverpool because they couldn't afford to go beyond Liverpool. But as you say, Liverpool is a very Irish city and very proud of its Irish connections. But Irish people, they had emigrated before 1845, and so they had set up networks, and those networks then allowed for other people to come and join those networks. So somebody from Mayo would go and they'd live with other people from Mayo. So those networks, even to this day, are very important. But the Irish people, maybe because they're an island people and because of their centuries of oppression and poverty, they have never been afraid to emigrate, and they've never been afraid to go everywhere. So as you say, I haven't visited a place which doesn't have an Irish pub, and which is always very welcome when I see it. Where I live in Connecticut now, and the town next to me is Westport, so of course the Mayo connection. So Irish people, traveled everywhere. But I think what's remarkable, and I see it in America, but wherever I go, is wherever they went, even though they were able to assimilate, it seems they took their love of Ireland with them. But also, I think they took their memory of the famine. And I see for many Irish Americans, the famine, and there were other famines, but what we call the Great Famine is part of what they see as being their foundation myth or foundation story. It's what shaped them as a people and what gave them resilience and strength. And in some ways, anti-British feeling, because in the post-famine decades in America, the nationalist movement was very, very strong in America and wherever the Irish settled. So I think emigration is an escape, but for some people it was also an exile. Even though they did well, they blamed the British government for that exile. So it's a very complicated process.
And on that, I suppose, interesting and complex note, Professor Christine Kinealy, thank you very much.
Thank you, Liam. Great to speak to a Tipperary man.
Hey.
up tip.
Hey, just before you go, please like this podcast, rate it 5 stars if you can, and then also comment if you can, something nice or any advice you have, and share this with anyone you think might be interested in either history or heritage. And it's not just Irish focus, it's international focus as well. So, thank you.